Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies for this evening's event assessing the possible impact of China's foreign policy. Well, China's ballooning defence budget and forceful territorial claims are raising fears in capitals across Asia. Asian nations are asking whether Beijing will remain faithful to its peaceful rise doctrine, or will China attempt to use its newfound military might to seize control of vast tracts of disputed land and sea. Meanwhile, Sino-US ties are being strained by numerous irritants. China's acrimonious territorial disputes that it's having with US allies and partners, Washington's pivot to Asia, intellectual property theft, and much besides. The world's two most powerful nations increasingly see each other as strategic rivals and potential enemies rather than partners. Will it be possible simultaneously to reassure Asia's established powers and engineer China's peaceful rise? Or will deteriorating regional relations jeopardise Asia's age of peace and prosperity?
Thank you very much for joining us here at the CIS today. It's great to be able to welcome such a big crowd to the building. I'm hoping that the other speakers will offer some optimism and practical policy solutions as the presentation goes on, because I'm going to start with the doom and gloom. Now, there's an understandable suspicion that diplomacy and foreign policy analysis is often talk for the sake of talk. To misquote Winston Churchill's famous aphorism, we might even say that sometimes we dream up the prospect of war for the sake of justifying more jaw. Breathless talk of deteriorating regional relations, or the possibility of a disastrous misjudgment are usually cause for interminable speculation. Now, I'm sure that cynicism is sometimes justified, but what I want to do tonight in my brief presentation is argue that the debate about how to preserve peace in Asia isn't one of those instances. Right now, Asia confronts a real and massive challenge. And being able to overcome this challenge is by no means a given. This challenge is nothing less than the extremely contentious rebalancing of global power. It's a combination of the United States going into relative decline, China rapidly rising, and other resurgent Asian nations asserting themselves. It's tempting to look to the past for guidance on how to manage this complex and volatile power dynamic. Like Hillary Clinton's "I'm not saying Putin is Hitler, but" remark, historical analogies are often thrown around in the debate about the future of Asia's international relations. For commentators and analysts in Washington, China is frequently cast as the ghost of the Cold War past. China has a different system of government, which is to say, it's unapologetically authoritarian, and seems to advocate a different vision of Asia's international order, which is to say, an international order that isn't led by the United States. And it therefore seems to follow that China represents a dangerous threat to Asia's current international order of open societies and open markets. Taking the other side of the Pacific, from the CCP's vantage point in Beijing, Washington seems to be playing the role of an old imperial power of sorts. It insists on meddling in China's internal affairs. This is the refrain that the United States has a tendency to intrude and worry about human rights in China and encourage domestic reform when it has no place to encourage domestic changes. And Washington is also apparently working to block China's reasonable ambitions for a greater role in world affairs. Worse still, Washington seems to be assembling a concert of powers to hem China in. Deep US security alliances with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, the commitment to de facto Taiwanese independence, and expanding relations with Beijing's former enemies, like Vietnam and India. All of that seems to confirm the Chinese suspicion. There's no denying that these analogies are neat and convenient narratives. They help confirm the worst fears of those in Beijing and Washington who might be looking for easy enemies. But they misdiagnose Asia's real challenge. China is no Soviet Union Mark II, and the United States has no real interest in interfering in China's affairs and undermining its rise in the way Japan and European powers did in the 19th and 20th centuries. Historical analogies might be unhelpful when it comes to plotting a peaceful course for Asia, but what then should we be looking for? My view is that there are two underlying dynamics that we need to confront. These, what I call potentially toxic trends, are China's challenge to its Asian neighbors, this is the first one, and Sino-US suspicion, that's the second one. I want to say that peace will be preserved or lost in Asia, depending on how we tackle these developments. It will determine whether Asia's incredible run of rising prosperity and relative peace continues, or whether the region degenerates into hostile international relations, a souring of fruitful economic ties, and perhaps even war. All of that seems incredibly far-fetched from our vantage point, but all of that is still a very real possibility. So let's go to the first toxic trend. China's challenge to its Asian neighbors is as much about the rest of Asia as it is about China. It's got two key ingredients. The first is Beijing's territorial claims and military resurgence. And the second is the reluctance of Asian nations to cede territory to China and their eagerness to hedge against Chinese power. The combination of these two toxic trends is proving explosive. These two ingredients is proving explosive. Across Asia, nations are forcefully resisting Chinese territorial claims, pumping up their defense budget, and banding together with other Asian nations and the United States to counteract China. So to see how this is playing out, let's take a tour around Asia of sorts. And let's start on the subcontinent. India and China are at loggerheads over Arunachal Pradesh, claimed by China and controlled by India, and Aksai Chin, claimed by India and controlled by China. Beijing's financial and infrastructure assistance for New Delhi's neighbors, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, is also producing fears of encirclement in a string of pearls of Chinese client states. In response, New Delhi is deepening relations with Beijing's former enemies. India and Japan have a steadily maturing strategic partnership. It includes joint naval exercises and high-level security dialogues. These two Asian powers have also rebuked Beijing by stating their shared opposition to any attempts to change Asia's territorial status quo. Meanwhile, India's Look East policy has also produced a strategic partnership with Vietnam. New Delhi has offered Hanoi credit for defense purchases, training for its submarine crews, and assistance to explore and exploit hydrocarbon reserves in the disputed South China Sea. Once again, this is a thinly veiled jab from India aimed at China's territorial assertiveness. China also weighs heavily on India's defense establishment. India increased its defense budget by more than 12% to $38 billion in 2013, which, not at all coincidentally, is a similar percentage increase to China's increase that year. And this impulse to counteract Chinese power is likely to continue to animate Indian policy planning. The favorite to be the next Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has even accused China of having an expansionist mindset. Moving east, for the Philippines and Vietnam, China is also a cause of deep concern. The Sino-Vietnamese War and past bloody clashes over islands in the South China Sea are keenly remembered in Vietnam. More recently, Hanoi maintains that China has repeatedly vandalized Vietnamese vessels operating in the South China Sea. while Manila and Beijing were locked in a naval standoff over Scarborough Shoal in April 2012. And moving right to the present, in January this year, China announced restrictions on non-Chinese fishing vessels in vast areas of the South China Sea, claimed by both the Philippines and Vietnam. Not surprisingly, Manila and Hanoi have drawn closer to the United States and sought to scale up their naval defenses. The Philippines secured $50 million worth of military assistance from the United States this year, and Washington offered Hanoi $18 million worth of naval aid in 2013, including new Coast Guard vessels. Vietnam and the United States have also agreed to deeper naval cooperation as part of their comprehensive partnership, while Manila is seeking more naval ships from Washington and is nearing a final agreement to allow the rotation of US forces through the Philippines. Moving north, and we see a similar dynamic playing out. Japan's violent and acrimonious history with China is an obvious drag on relations. And this sore point is inflamed by semi-regular visits by Japanese political leaders to Yasukuni Shrine, a site of national pilgrimage honoring, among millions of war dead, war criminals. This prompts China to regularly accuse Japan of nothing less than returning to its belligerent past and threatening world peace. More contemporary problems are also straining relations. In 2012, Tokyo nationalized the disputed but previously privately owned and Japanese-controlled Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands. This provoked a Chinese consumer boycott of Japanese products and a 9% fall in imports from Japan, as well as a sharp drop in Japanese investment in China. Then in November last year, Beijing unilaterally established the Air Defense Identification Zone over the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, which requires foreign aircraft to submit flight plans to Chinese authorities. Taking all of this together, feeling that its security and territory are threatened, Japan under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is pursuing a policy of what's called active pacifism. What was the Japanese strictly self-defense force will become a collective self-defense force, effectively allowing Japan to come to the defense of an ally, the obvious candidate being the United States. Tokyo has also ended almost 2 decades of stagnant defense spending, with Japan's already massive defense budget rising by more than 2% in 2014 to US $47 billion. Elsewhere in North Asia, China's ADIZ decision even upset South Korea. South Korea's president was feted in Beijing last year, and the history of Japanese colonialism on the Korean peninsula has seemed to push Seoul towards a Beijing-friendly stance, so to speak. But South Korea took umbrage at China's ADIZ and expanded its own ADIZ at the end of last year. I could go on with many more examples. I've not mentioned Singapore's enthusiastic support for the US decision to move more of its military assets to Asia, or the way in which previously softly spoken Asian nations, like Malaysia, are now loudly taking exception to China's territorial assertiveness. I think that, in general, though, we have a clear enough picture. Much of the rest of Asia's relations with China are already contentious and steadily becoming more fraught. Now, worryingly, there's no end in sight to this dynamic. 2 events early this month confirm the bleak outlook. The Chinese foreign minister recently said that Beijing will defend every inch of territory that belongs to China, stressing that there is no room for compromise in territorial and historical issues. All of this being very thinly veiled code for Beijing's steadfast commitment to eventually taking control of territory its neighbors claim as their own. At almost the same time, earlier this month, China's new $132 billion military budget was announced, more than 12% up on last year. And according to some analysts, it's likely as high as $240 billion, which would mean that it's steadily pushing in the direction of half the US defense budget. So clearly, China's challenge to its Asian neighbors has only just begun. Asia's second toxic trend that I mentioned earlier is deepening Sino-US suspicion. talk of a new model of major country relations based on win-win cooperation, no conflict or confrontation, and mutual respect is all very soothing. This is the popular diplomatic speak doing the rounds in Beijing and Washington. But the problem is that it seems to have fly in the face of some obvious facts. In a number of really important arenas, Beijing and Washington seem to suspect the other of seeking to achieve its long-term goals at great cost to their own core interests. We see this suspicion in the opinion pages of influential newspapers, analysis from academics and experts on both sides, and statements from officials. Perhaps most obviously, there's deep suspicion regarding strategic intent. Washington suspects Beijing of seeking to push the United States out of the Western Pacific and claim leadership of Asia, while Beijing imagines that the Obama administration's signature military and diplomatic pivot to Asia is designed to contain legitimate Chinese ambitions in the region. Then there are widespread suspicions stemming from the dramatic shift in the regional balance of power. Washington is asking whether Beijing's rise will eventually overturn the US-led liberal international order, while Beijing fears that the United States will doggedly stall its own relative decline and block China's rise. Finally, suspicions are raised further by vastly different political systems and traditions. In US eyes, China's staunchly authoritarian one-party state is a threat to America's global democratization efforts. While Chinese might wonder whether US efforts to spread liberal democracy are aimed at undermining their own political system. Taking these cases of mutual mistrust together, cross-Pacific friendship looks increasingly unlikely. In fact, if China and the United States are not already rivals or even enemies, this deepening Sino-US suspicion risks making them just that. So all of this prompts the question, what do we do now? How do we minimize the fallout from China's challenge to its Asian neighbors? And how do we avoid China and the United States making enemies of each other? I'm sure the other speakers will provide valuable policy proposals, and time for the obligatory shameless plug. I've suggested some strategies in the report that Peter was talking about. But what I've tried to do here is not offer the remedy, but diagnose the illness. We're up against two massive challenges. We've got to reassure China's neighbors and make sure that China doesn't ride roughshod over their interests. And we've got to ensure that Beijing and Washington don't make enemies of each other through mutual suspicion and misunderstanding. For now at least, happily, the risk of war in Asia is low. However, to go back to my original mangling of Winston Churchill's aphorism, unless there's much more jaw about these dangers to peace in Asia, war will remain an all too real danger. Thank you.